The UK has not had a great year.
The British economy is in a recession.
The UK is struggling with political instability.
Highest inflation in 40 years.
The British pound hitting an all-time low.
Rents are going up. Recession.
Britain is going through a deep economic and social crisis. Large parts of the government are unable to provide their services. The economy seems to have hit the wall. Life is becoming increasingly difficult for a growing part of the population, and the future is looking pretty grim. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because the problems that the UK has did not start this year. They go a lot deeper than you think, and they're not gonna go away anytime soon. But what went wrong? How did Britain go from an economic superpower to being called the sick man of Europe once again? And how bad it really is? This is the dark side of Britain, the fall from grace. But first, let me tell you about a sponsor of this video, Brilliant. Brilliant is the best way to learn math, science, and computer science in an easy to understand and interactive way. It has literally thousands of lessons on all kinds of topics, and new ones are added every month. If you're curious about how the world works, from algorithms to the universe, Brilliant is your one-stop shop and your favorite new destination. And unlike in school, Brilliant explains everything in a way that you actually understand, and you can learn at your own pace and whenever you want. So to get started for free, visit brilliant.org/explainedwithdom or click on the link in the description. You'll get a free trial, and the first 200 people will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. And now, back to the video. So while it may seem like the UK has had a pretty bad year, if you take a step back, you'll see that it actually had a pretty bad decade. Since 2008, the UK has experienced both one of the slowest periods of economic growth in its history and a decline in living standards. Since prices have grown more quickly than wages, the average income is now lower than it was 10 years ago if you adjust it for inflation. And there are other statistics suggesting that things are not going so well. Child poverty has increased, violent crime has gone up, and almost 9% of British households are worried about having enough food, which in one of the richest countries in the world is a bit strange. And since 2020, this has only been getting worse, as the economy is heading into a recession, wages are not growing, and inflation is going through the roof. But how did this happen? Well, there are three main reasons, and all of them are stemming from three decisions that Britain has made in the past decades. The first reason is the radical transformation of the British economy at a time that was in many ways similar to what the UK is going through now, the 1970s. Back then, the country was crippled by waves of strikes and protests, being called the sick man of Europe, and it has been in such a bad economic shape that it had to get an IMF bailout just to avoid a total economic collapse. And then one of the most famous British politicians came up with a radical plan on how to turn the economy and the whole country around. Once she became Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher launched a series of major economic reforms. She introduced tax cuts, deregulated the whole economy and the financial markets, privatized assets and companies owned by the state, and encouraged people to start buying homes to boost economic activity. And despite an enormous criticism that came both for the reforms themselves and for her ruthless style, the reforms had results. Thatcher managed to turn the downfall of the British economy around, and from the late 1980s, she started 2 decades of economic growth. Finally, the British productivity, basically how efficient the economy is, has started going up after decades of stagnation. And the British economy started growing faster than in most other G7 countries, with the growth being driven by sectors like finance, banking, and property development that benefited from the reforms the most. Now, not everyone was happy. Thatcher was criticized for destroying the British heavy industry, traditionally employing a large part of the working class, and for making the economy too dependent on the financial and real estate sectors. But it worked. Unless there was a major crisis that would obliterate the entire financial sector, it didn't seem like it should stop.
Lehman Brothers is going bankrupt.
UK's biggest banks are
Monday in
rescued
the
by the
financial
British
market.
taxpayers.
The Dow tumbled more than
We're
500
facing a
points.
major economic downturn.
In 2008, the UK was hit by the global financial crisis, taking down all of the most important sectors and causing critical damage to the entire economy. But even though Britain was not the only place that was badly hit by the crisis, unlike most other countries, the UK has never really recovered from that. The thing is that the UK has a major problem in what's called productivity. Basically, how much economic value people create per hour of work. Apart from the financial sector, productivity in the UK is way behind its traditional competitors, like Germany, US, or even France, and it's falling behind more and more every year. And so, even though people in the UK work longer hours than in most European countries, that work is far less effective. And while this productivity crisis was not as important when the finance sector was booming, after the financial crisis, there was not much else that could replace it. But it wasn't just the financial crisis, but also how the UK decided to respond to it. Because the British reaction to the financial crisis has been quite unique, and it became another reason behind many of the issues it is dealing with now. After 2008, the UK government has decided to react to the situation by implementing a policy of austerity. Basically, it's a fancy name for cutting public spending in pretty much every area in which the state spends money, and on a fairly extreme level. Funding for the police, social services, welfare programs, or local governments have been slashed, and funding for other areas like healthcare or education has been basically capped at the same level since 2008. The UK wasn't the only country that restricted its spending after 2008, but there are two key differences. First, the cuts in public spending in the UK were exceptionally strict, and second, while most countries only kept their budget restrictions in place for a few years, in the UK, the austerity never really ended. And there is a growing amount of evidence that the brutal and prolonged austerity policy has had devastating effects on the British society, especially on the working class. According to the United Nations, the policy of austerity has entrenched high levels of poverty and inflicted unnecessary misery in the UK, especially for people with lower income. The amount of people who use food banks has skyrocketed from 25,000 people to 2.5 million people in 2021. Child poverty has increased, and so did the average household debt. The national healthcare provider, the NHS, is so severely underfunded that Brits now have the worst access to healthcare in Europe. And because of budget restrictions, the police force has been reduced by 20,000 officers, or 14% of the entire force, making it unable to perform its duties, especially in poorer areas, resulting in an increase in violent crime. And it doesn't look like it should end anytime soon, because the government is basically starting Austerity 2.0, even though the first one never ended. And it's introducing more cuts to an already incredibly underfunded system of public services. And so it's not surprising that everyone from nurses and doctors to firefighters and rail workers is going on strike, and claiming that this is just not sustainable. And finally, on top of everything, Britain decided to put on a masterclass in shooting yourself in the foot by voluntarily leaving the single biggest economic bloc in the world. Even though Britain was promised that Brexit would not damage its economy, but actually help it, 6 years later, we have a solid amount of evidence that this was not true, and that Brexit amplifies all the economic problems that the UK is dealing with, and creates a lot of new ones on top. Since the UK is no longer in the single European market, it became much more difficult for British companies to export into the EU, which is where almost half of Britain's export goes to. To sell anything from the UK to the EU is now a lot more expensive. There is a lot more bureaucracy around it, and it takes a lot longer. And that means one of two things. If you have a small company in the UK, it is now much harder to expand into the EU, Britain's closest and by far largest trading partner. And if you have a large company, it might make sense to move your business or a part of it from the UK to the EU, as the European market is a lot bigger than the British one. But in either case, for the UK, this means a lot less economic value created and a lot less money for the government in form of taxes. And even those businesses that do not export outside of the UK are impacted by Brexit as well, especially in the form of a labor crisis, since many sectors like hospitality or construction depended on foreign labor from the EU. And unsurprisingly, since Brexit, many of those people have left, and now 3 out of 4 British businesses are facing labor shortages, which further slows down the economy. The official British economic forecaster, the Government Office for Budget Responsibility, estimates that Brexit will cost the UK roughly 4% of its GDP, or £100 billion, and most of that damage is still yet to come. Now, the UK is still one of the largest and most developed economies in the world, but the fact is that it's going through some really tough times. And with the combination of a chronically underfunded government, Brexit, and the current economic meltdown, the future of Great Britain does not seem that great anymore.